My wife texted, "I'll be staying at David's tonight, don't wait up." I replied, "Thanks for letting me know." Then I packed her entire wardrobe in boxes and left them at David's door. Her 3 a.m. panic call. My name is Adrian Holt, and I'm 32 years old, which means I'm supposedly old enough to know better, but apparently still dumb enough to fall for the oldest trick in the book. If you'd asked me last week, hell, if you'd asked me yesterday morning while I was sipping my overpriced coffee and scrolling through LinkedIn like some kind of functional adult, I would have told you I had my shit together. I was happily married to Sophie, my wife of 3 years, had a stable career in architecture that didn't make me want to throw myself off the buildings I designed, and owned a townhouse that was slowly but surely draining my bank account in the most American way possible. Sophie was what you'd call a catch, at least on paper. Charming in that effortless way that made waiters remember her name and strangers strike up conversations at grocery stores. Ambitious to the point where she'd network at a funeral if she thought it could advance her career. She was always the center of attention at parties, the kind of woman who could walk into a room and somehow make everyone else feel like they were auditioning for her approval. I used to love watching her work a crowd, thinking I was the lucky bastard who got to take her home at the end of the night. What a goddamn idiot I was. See, Sophie had this job in marketing, or was it public relations? Honestly, I could never keep track because her job description seemed to change depending on who was asking and how impressive she needed to sound. But whatever the hell she was doing, it required a lot of networking. And by networking, I mean staying out until 2 in the morning at industry events that somehow never had any photos posted on social media. Funny how that works, right? Now, I'm not some controlling psycho who demands to know where his wife is every second of the day. I believe in trust, in giving people space to breathe and grow and all that modern relationship bullshit they write about in those self-help books that cluttered our nightstand. But there's trust, and then there's being a goddamn doormat. And somewhere along the way, I'd crossed that line without even realizing it. The financial arrangement we had should have been my first red flag, but hindsight's 2020, and I was apparently wearing beer goggles for 3 straight years. Sophie never chipped in much financially, and by not much, I mean practically nothing. I paid the mortgage on our townhouse, a mortgage that made my accountant wince every time we reviewed my finances. I covered the utilities, the internet, the cable package she insisted we needed because everyone watches HBO. I bought most of the groceries, funded our date nights, and somehow ended up paying for her gym membership because we're a team, babe. Every month, I get a little tighter around the collar when the bills came in, but I told myself it was temporary. Sophie was building her career, finding her footing in a competitive industry. Once she got that promotion she was always talking about, once she landed that big client she was always chasing, she'd start contributing more. We were partners, and partners supported each other through thick and thin, right? That's what marriage was supposed to be about. What a load of horseshit that turned out to be. But the real kicker, the thing that should have sent me running for the hills faster than a tourist fleeing a Times Square Elmo, was how she guarded her phone. That little device was practically surgically attached to her hand, always face down on whatever surface was nearby, locked tighter than Fort Knox. She'd changed the passcode from our anniversary date, which I'd known because, we used to share things like normal couples, to something I couldn't guess if my life depended on it. Privacy is important in a relationship, she'd say whenever I made some casual comment about her phone habits. We don't need to know everything about each other's lives. And like the trusting fool I was, I'd nod and agree because that sounded reasonable, didn't it? Mature couples respected boundaries. Healthy relationships required individual space. All that Dr. Phil bullshit that sounds great in theory, but falls apart the moment you realize your wife is treating you like a roommate who happens to pay all the bills. The late nights started getting longer somewhere around year 2 of our marriage. What used to be the occasional work dinner became weekly events, then twice weekly, then practically every goddamn night of the week. Sophie would text me around 5 o'clock, always a text, never a call, letting me know she wouldn't be home for dinner. Big client meeting, or team building event, or my personal favorite, mandatory company social. I'd eat alone more often than not, sitting at our dining table that could seat 6, but usually only seated one lonely architect wondering where the hell his wife was. I'd save her leftovers, like some kind of devoted golden retriever waiting for his owner to come home. Sometimes she'd eat them the next day, Sometimes they'd sit in the fridge until they went bad and I'd throw them out, feeling guilty about the waste. The unease started as this tiny knot in my stomach, like when you know you've forgotten something important but can't remember what. It grew slowly, fed by her secretive phone calls in the bathroom, her sudden interest in working out, her new wardrobe that somehow appeared without any corresponding credit card charges on our joint account. Little things that individually meant nothing, but together painted a picture I was too fucking stupid to see. Love meant trust, I kept telling myself. If you loved someone, you believed in them. You gave them the benefit of the doubt. You didn't turn into some paranoid psycho who checked up on their spouse like they were a teenager with a fake ID. I was better than that. We were better than that. Or so I thought. Looking back now, I can see how perfectly I played my role in this whole charade. I was the ideal Mark. Trusting, financially stable, emotionally invested, and just naive enough to mistake being taken advantage of for being a supportive husband. I was so busy congratulating myself on being the kind of modern man who didn't need to control his wife that I completely missed the fact that my wife was living a completely separate life that didn't include me except as a source of financial security. But last week, all of that comfortable self-deception came crashing down around me like a house of cards in a hurricane. And the funny thing is, it wasn't some dramatic revelation or catching her in some obvious lie. It was just a text message. One simple, honest text message that finally showed me exactly where I stood in Sophie's world. Turns out, the truth really can set you free. It just hurts like hell first. It was a Tuesday evening, the kind of ordinary weeknight that you'd forget about 5 minutes after living it if it weren't for the fact that it completely blew up your entire fucking life. I was standing in our kitchen, my kitchen, as it turns out, wearing the stupid apron Sophie had bought me for Christmas that read, "Kiss the Cook," in obnoxiously cheerful letters. Real cute, right? Except the only person kissing this cook these days was apparently nobody, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I was making my specialty, which is basically the only thing I can cook without setting off the smoke detector. Spaghetti with meat sauce from a jar, because I'm not some Food Network superstar, just a guy trying to have dinner ready when his wife got home from another one of her mysterious work events. The pasta was boiling away, filling the kitchen with that starchy steam that makes you feel domestic and accomplished, like you've got your shit together even when you absolutely don't. The meat was browning in the pan, making those satisfying sizzling sounds that remind you why humans invented cooking in the first place. I was actually feeling pretty good about myself, thinking maybe Sophie would appreciate coming home to a hot meal for once instead of having to scrounge through leftover takeout containers or eat cereal for dinner like some kind of college freshman. My phone was sitting on the counter next to the stove, and when it buzzed with that familiar text notification sound, I didn't even look at it right away. I was too busy trying not to burn the ground beef because apparently I can't multitask worth a damn when it comes to cooking. But the buzz registered in my brain as Sophie texting me her ETA, maybe letting me know she was running late but would be home soon, the usual dance we'd been doing for months. So I wiped my hands on that ridiculous apron, picked up my phone, and swiped to read what I assumed would be another variation of stuck in traffic or meeting running over, start without me. You know, the standard bullshit I'd gotten used to accepting as normal married life. Instead, what I saw made my stomach drop faster than a faulty elevator. "I'll be staying at David's tonight. Don't wait up." That was it. No explanation. No apology. No something came up, or emergency situation, or even a half-assed excuse about a work crisis. Just a casual, matter-of-fact announcement that my wife would be spending the night at another man's house, delivered with all the emotion of someone telling me they'd picked up milk on the way home. I stared at those words on my phone screen until they started to blur, reading them over and over again like maybe I'd misunderstood something. Like maybe there was some hidden meaning I was missing, some context that would make this make sense in the world where I was a happily married man whose wife occasionally worked late but always came home to our bed. David, her co-worker, the guy whose name had been popping up in conversation more and more frequently over the past few months. David from the office who was so funny and really gets the industry and has such great ideas for the Henderson campaign. David who she'd mentioned was going through a divorce and needed friends to support him through this difficult time. David whose jokes she laughed at just a little too loudly during those rare office functions I actually got invited to, her hand touching his arm while she threw her head back like he was the funniest motherfucker who ever lived. My pulse didn't race like you'd expect. It didn't spike with anger or panic or any of those dramatic emotions you see in movies when someone's world collapses. Instead, it slowed down, like my heart was suddenly working underwater, each beat deliberate and heavy and final. It was the weirdest goddamn thing, this calm that settled over me like fog rolling in from the ocean. I could hear the meat still sizzling in the pan behind me, probably starting to burn now that I wasn't paying attention, but I couldn't bring myself to care. The pasta water was bubbling away, probably overcooking into mush, but that seemed about as important as yesterday's weather forecast. I stood there in my stupid apron, holding my phone, and for the first time in 3 years of marriage, I saw the situation clearly. Not through the rose-colored glasses of trust and love and partnership, but with the brutal clarity that comes when someone finally stops lying to you because they don't think you're worth the effort anymore. This wasn't some last-minute work emergency. This wasn't Sophie being a good colleague to a friend in need. This was my wife telling me, in the most casual way possible, that she'd chosen to spend the night in another man's bed, and she expected me to just accept it like the well-trained doormat I'd apparently become. The funny thing is, part of me wanted to call her immediately, to demand an explanation, to yell and scream, and make her justify this bullshit decision. Part of me wanted to jump in my car and drive over to David's place and pound on the door like some unhinged husband in a bad Lifetime movie. But a bigger part of me, the part that had been quietly absorbing all those red flags for months, just felt tired. Instead, I did something that surprised even me. I typed back, "Thanks for letting me know." 4 words. Polite, acknowledging, completely fucking calm. Not, "What the hell do you mean?" Or "Are you fucking kidding me right now?" Or "We need to talk." Just a simple thank you, like she'd told me she'd picked up my dry cleaning. I hit send and watched the message disappear into the digital void, carrying with it any pretense that our marriage was something worth fighting for. That's when my father's voice echoed in my head, clear as if the old man was standing right there in the kitchen with me. He'd been dead for 5 years, but his advice about relationships had always stuck with me, probably because he'd learned it the hard way himself. A partner who hides is already gone, Adrian. Don't beg someone who's chosen to leave. Have some goddamn dignity. At the time, I'd thought he was just being cynical, bitter about his own divorce from my mother. But standing there with Sophie's text message glowing on my phone screen, I finally understood what he meant. Sophie wasn't hiding anymore. She was being completely honest about her priorities, and I wasn't one of them. I turned off the burner under the meat, which had indeed started to burn and was filling the kitchen with that acrid smell of neglected cooking. I drained the pasta, which had turned to mush just like I'd predicted. Then I walked to the hall closet, pulled out a stack of empty moving boxes I'd saved from our last move, because I'm apparently the kind of person who saves cardboard just in case, and started climbing the stairs to our bedroom. It was time to help Sophie with her obviously inevitable transition to her new living situation. I climbed those stairs to our bedroom like I was walking to my own execution, except instead of facing death, I was facing the systematic dismantling of 3 years of shared delusions. The moving boxes under my arm felt heavier than they should have, weighed down by the gravity of what I was about to do. Each step creaked under my feet. Our townhouse was old enough to have character, which is realtor speak for everything makes noise and nothing works quite right. The bedroom door was open, and stepping inside felt like entering a crime scene where the only victim was my own stupidity. Sophie's presence was everywhere. Her jewelry scattered across the dresser like expensive breadcrumbs. Her clothes draped over the chair in that casual way that used to seem charming, but now looked like the careless attitude of someone who never had to clean up after herself because she knew some sucker would do it for her. I set the boxes down on the hardwood floor with a hollow thud that seemed to echo through the room. For a moment, I just stood there, hands on my hips, surveying the landscape of our shared life like a general planning a strategic retreat. Where the hell do you even start when you're packing up a marriage? Do you go chronologically, starting with the oldest stuff and working your way to the newest? Do you pack by category, all the dresses together, all the shoes in another box? Or do you just grab whatever's closest and shove it in cardboard containers like you're fleeing a natural disaster? I decided to start with her closet because it was right there, and because I figured I might as well get the biggest job out of the way first. Sophie had more clothes than a department store, which always amazed me considering she claimed to never have any money to contribute to our household expenses. Apparently, there's always cash for a new dress or those ridiculously expensive shoes that cost more than my monthly car payment. But splitting the electric bill? That's where things got tight. I pulled the first box toward me and started with her dresses. The black cocktail dress she'd worn to my company Christmas party last year, where she'd spent most of the evening talking to my boss about synergistic opportunities while I stood around like a well-dressed accessory. Folded and boxed. The red sundress from our anniversary dinner 2 months ago, where she'd spent half the meal texting someone about urgent work stuff that apparently couldn't wait until business hours. Folded and boxed. Each piece of clothing felt like I was handling evidence from my own trial. Proof of all the times I'd ignored the obvious signs that my wife was living a completely separate life. That blue blouse she'd bought for client meetings, but somehow never seemed to wear when she was actually meeting clients I knew about. The designer jeans that appeared in her wardrobe without any corresponding charge on our credit card statements. Our statements, as if we were actually partners in anything other than name. The mechanical nature of folding and packing was almost therapeutic, like meditation for the recently betrayed. Fold the sleeve, smooth the fabric, place it in the box. Repeat. Each item removed from our shared space was another step toward reclaiming my own life, my own home, my own goddamn sanity. Her favorite gowns were hanging in the back of the closet, the fancy stuff she wore to those networking events that somehow never resulted in any actual business that I could see. The emerald green dress that hugged her curves in all the right places. I remembered buying that for her birthday last year, thinking I was being romantic and generous. She'd modeled it for me, spinning around in our bedroom while I told her she looked stunning. It's perfect for industry events, she'd said, and like an idiot, I'd felt proud that I'd chosen something she could use for work. Now, folding that same dress and placing it carefully in the box, I realized she'd probably worn it for David. All those compliments I'd given her, all that pride I'd felt in how beautiful my wife looked, and she'd been dressing up for another man while I paid the credit card bill. The handbags were next, and Jesus Christ, Sophie had a handbag problem that would have made shopping addicts weep with envy. Designer purses, casual totes, tiny clutches that cost more than some people's rent, all lined up on shelves like trophies from battles I didn't even know were being fought. I started grabbing them and stuffing them into boxes without the careful folding treatment I'd given the clothes. Handbags are sturdy. They can handle being tossed around a little, unlike marriages, which apparently crumble the moment someone stops pretending they give a shit. Her shoes required 2 entire boxes, and I'm not exaggerating. Sophie had more footwear than a small shoe store, everything from stilettos that could double as weapons to casual sneakers that cost more than my monthly gym membership. I'd always marveled at how she could walk in those sky-high heels, but now I wondered if she'd been practicing for quick escapes. Maybe that's what all those late-night work events were really about, learning to run in designer shoes when your lies finally caught up with you. The jewelry box was sitting on her dresser like a small treasure chest, and opening it felt like discovering pirate loot, if pirates were into overpriced accessories from department stores. Necklaces, earrings, bracelets, rings, most of them gifts from me for birthdays, anniversaries, Valentine's Days, and random thinking of you moments that seemed important at the time, but now felt like payments to a contractor who never finished the job. That gold necklace I'd given her for our second anniversary was tangled up with earrings I didn't recognize, probably gifts from David, though I couldn't prove it and didn't really want to. I dumped the whole jewelry box into a smaller container, letting everything jumble together like the mixed-up mess our marriage had apparently been from the start. The hardest part was the scarf. It was silk, cream-colored with little blue flowers, and she'd worn it on our first trip together to that bed and breakfast in Vermont. We'd been so happy that weekend, or at least I'd thought we were happy. We'd walked through those maple forests, talked about our future, made plans that apparently meant more to me than they did to her. She'd wrapped that scarf around her neck against the autumn wind, and I'd thought she looked like something out of a romantic movie. Now, holding that same scarf in my hands, I could feel the weight of all those false memories. Had she been thinking about other men even then? Had I been so busy playing the role of devoted boyfriend that I'd missed all the signs that she was already planning her exit strategy? I folded the scarf carefully and placed it in the box with the rest of her accessories, trying not to think about how many other firsts In our relationship had been lies she was telling herself as much as me. The perfume bottles on her dresser were next, expensive stuff that she claimed was necessary for professional appearances, but somehow never appeared on our budget discussions. I recognized the brands from those fancy department store counters where everything costs more than my monthly grocery bill. Some of the bottles were nearly empty, well-loved favorites that had been part of her daily routine. Others looked barely touched, like she'd bought them on impulse or received them as gifts from people who weren't me. The smell hit me when I moved the bottles. That familiar scent that used to mean Sophie was getting ready to go out with me. Sophie was coming home to me. Sophie was lying next to me in bed. Now it just smelled sour, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. Even her toothbrush had to go. It was sitting in the holder next to mine on the bathroom counter, a bright purple electric model that had cost more than my first car payment back in college. Looking at those two toothbrushes sitting side by side in their little ceramic holder. His and hers, like we were some kind of normal married couple who brushed their teeth together and talked about their days and actually gave a damn about each other's well-being. I felt something crack inside my chest that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite sadness. I grabbed her toothbrush, her expensive face creams, her contact lens solution, her birth control pills, which explained why she'd never seemed worried about getting pregnant when we talked about having kids someday, and tossed them all into a plastic bag that went into one of the boxes. By midnight, I'd filled 8 moving boxes and 2 large suitcases with the physical remnants of Sophie's presence in my life. The bedroom looked foreign now, like a hotel room after housekeeping had come through and erased all evidence of the previous occupant. My clothes hung in the closet with room to breathe. My side of the dresser wasn't crowded anymore. The bathroom counter actually had space for my stuff. Without her clutter everywhere, the bedroom felt bigger, cleaner, like someone had opened windows and let fresh air chase out the stale atmosphere of secrets and lies. I wasn't grieving, I realized as I stood there surveying my work. I was dismantling a lie, piece by piece, box by box, until all that remained was the truth. I'd been living with a stranger who'd been using me as a financial safety net while she explored her other options. The strangest part was how good it felt to reclaim my own space, to see my home without her stamp all over it. This townhouse that I'd worked so hard to afford, that I'd been so proud to share with the woman I thought I'd married, was finally mine again. Clean, quiet, and honest in a way it hadn't been for months. Time to return Sophie's belongings to their rightful owner, or at least, to the guy who was apparently taking delivery of my wife along with everything else. Loading my car with Sophie's belongings at 11 o'clock at night felt like I was disposing of evidence from a crime scene. Except the only crime committed here was my own willful blindness to 3 years of red flags waving in my face like semaphores in a hurricane. My Honda Accord wasn't exactly built for moving services. It's a sensible sedan for a sensible architect who thought he had a sensible marriage, but I managed to cram 8 boxes and 2 suitcases into every available space like some kind of automotive Tetris champion. The boxes filled my trunk, my back seat, and even the passenger seat, turning my car into a mobile storage unit for my wife's abandoned life. I had to adjust my rearview mirror because a particularly large box was blocking my view, which seemed oddly symbolic. For 3 years, I'd been driving through marriage with my vision obstructed, and now I was literally doing the same thing. Except this time it was intentional. The drive across town gave me plenty of time to think, which was probably the last thing I needed right then. The streets were mostly empty except for the occasional late-night wanderer and the steady stream of delivery trucks that keep our consumer economy humming along while normal people sleep. I passed the coffee shop where Sophie and I used to go on Sunday mornings, back when we still did things together that didn't involve me paying for everything while she checked her phone. I passed the restaurant where we'd had our last anniversary dinner, where she'd spent half the meal responding to work emails on that goddamn phone of hers. I'd thought she was just dedicated to her career, admired her work ethic, told myself it was sexy to be married to an ambitious woman who took her professional responsibilities seriously. What a fucking joke that turned out to be. David's building loomed ahead like some kind of modern fortress of infidelity, all glass and steel, and expensive-looking landscaping that screamed successful young professionals live here. I'd been to this building exactly once before, when Sophie had asked me to drop her off for what she'd called team drinks with her coworkers. I'd waited in the car while she ran inside to grab something from David's apartment, watching her disappear through the lobby doors and wondering why she needed to retrieve work documents from a colleague's home at 8 o'clock on a Saturday night. Now I knew exactly what she'd been grabbing, and it wasn't fucking paperwork. The parking situation was typical urban nightmare, street parking only, with those passive-aggressive signs that threaten your firstborn child if you park in the wrong spot for more than 37 minutes during a full moon. But it was nearly midnight, so I figured I could risk it for the few minutes this delivery would take. I found a spot right in front of the building, which felt like the universe finally throwing me a bone after months of cosmic middle fingers. The real challenge was going to be getting into the building without buzzing David's apartment, because I'd rather eat glass than give those two assholes advance warning that I was coming. I needed this to be a surprise, a midnight revelation that would shatter whatever cozy little fantasy they'd constructed about their affair being some kind of romantic adventure rather than a tired cliché played out by boring people who thought they'd invented adultery. Fate, as it turned out, was feeling cooperative for once in my goddamn life. As I was standing outside the building, arms full of Sophie's designer bullshit, wondering how I was going to sweet-talk my way past the security system, the lobby door opened, and some hipster in skinny jeans and an ironic t-shirt walked out, probably heading to one of those late-night establishments that serve overpriced cocktails to people who think staying up past 11 makes them edgy. I caught the door with my foot before it could close, nodding my thanks to the hipster who barely glanced at me, because apparently strange men carrying boxes into residential buildings at midnight is just Tuesday night in this neighborhood. Maybe this happened more often than I thought. Maybe David made a habit of collecting other men's wives along with their possessions. The lobby was all marble floors and modern lighting that probably cost more than my monthly salary, the kind of aggressively stylish design that announces rich people live here without actually having any personality. There was abstract art on the walls that looked like someone had sneezed paint on a canvas and charged $20,000 for the privilege. A doorman's desk sat empty. Apparently security took a break after normal human hours, which seemed like poor planning for a building that housed home-wrecking pieces of shit. The elevator ride to the 8th floor gave me time to practice my breathing and wonder if I was having some kind of mental breakdown. Normal people probably don't deliver their cheating spouse's belongings to their lover's apartment at midnight. Normal people probably scream and cry and demand explanations and try to work things out through couples therapy and uncomfortable conversations about communication and trust. But I'd never felt more clear-headed in my life. This wasn't a breakdown. This was clarity. This was the first honest thing I'd done in months, maybe years. Instead of pretending everything was fine while my wife slowly dismantled our marriage from the inside, I was taking action. I was solving a problem with the kind of direct approach that had made me a good architect. You identify the structural weakness, you address it immediately, and you don't waste time hoping it'll fix itself. The hallway on David's floor was carpeted in some neutral color that probably had a fancy name like whispered taupe or contemplative beige. The walls were painted that perfect shade of inoffensive off-white that property management companies love because it hides minor damage while sucking the soul out of any space it touches. Apartment doors stretched down the corridor like a lineup of suspects, each one hiding its own collection of secrets and lies and midnight deliveries. David's door was 8F, and standing in front of it with Sophie's entire wardrobe packed into boxes felt like the culmination of every ignored instinct I'd had over the past year. This was where my wife was spending her nights while I ate dinner alone and wondered why our marriage felt like a business arrangement where only one party was holding up their end of the contract. I set the boxes down as quietly as possible, stacking them neatly against the door like some kind of passive-aggressive care package. The suitcases went on either side, creating a little fortress of Sophie's abandoned life that David would discover when he opened his door in the morning. Or maybe Sophie would find them when she snuck out for her walk of shame, trying to get home before I woke up and noticed she'd never come to bed. The note was something I'd written while packing, a simple message folded into a small square of paper that I placed on top of the highest box, where it couldn't be missed. Sophie's belongings. She's yours now. Short, sweet, and to the fucking point. No accusations, no drama, no begging or pleading or angry rants about betrayal and broken trust. Just a simple acknowledgement of the new reality. David had won the prize of Sophie's full-time attention, along with all the financial responsibility that came with it. I pulled out my phone and took a picture of the whole setup. 8 boxes, 2 suitcases, and 1 note, arranged outside apartment 8F like some kind of surreal art installation titled The Remains of a Marriage. The photo wasn't for social media or revenge or anything petty like that. It was for me, proof that I'd actually done this thing, evidence that I'd finally stopped being a victim and started being a man who solved his own problems. The elevator ride back down felt different than the trip up. Lighter, somehow, like I'd left more than just Sophie's belongings on David's doorstep. I'd left behind 3 years of making excuses for someone who'd never deserved them. I'd left behind the version of myself who paid all the bills while his wife lived her real life somewhere else. I'd left behind the pathetic husband who cooked dinner every night for a woman who was probably eating takeout in another man's bed. Walking back to my car, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, genuine excitement about going home. Not to our home, with all its compromises and shared spaces and careful negotiations about whose turn it was to clean the bathroom. Home to my place, where I could eat cereal for dinner without judgment, watch whatever I wanted on TV without debate, and sleep in the middle of the bed without worrying about disturbing someone who'd rather be sleeping somewhere else anyway. The drive home was peaceful in a way that surprised me. I'd expected to feel angry or sad or confused, some combination of the emotions that normal people probably experience when their marriages explode in real time. Instead, I felt calm, focused, almost relieved. The hard part was done. I'd identified the problem, developed a solution, and executed it with the kind of efficiency that would have made my project management professors proud. Back at the townhouse, my townhouse now, I had one more task to complete before this night was officially over. I'd researched locksmith services while Sophie's clothes were in the dryer earlier, and found a 24-hour emergency service that charged premium rates but promised immediate response times for situations involving security concerns. Getting the locks changed at midnight probably qualified as a security concern, especially when your soon-to-be ex-wife had demonstrated a casual disregard for concepts like honesty, fidelity, and basic human decency. The locksmith was a grizzled guy named Pete who looked like he'd seen every variety of domestic drama that late-night lock changes usually represented. He didn't ask questions, didn't make conversation, just got to work with the professional competence of someone who'd installed a lot of fresh starts for people whose lives had recently gone sideways. 200 even, Pete said when he finished, handing me a set of shiny new keys that felt heavier than they should have. These are high-security locks, so make sure you don't lose them. Pain in the ass to replace. I paid him in cash and watched his van disappear down the street, leaving me standing in my own doorway with keys to my own house, finally able to control who had access to my space, my life, my peace of mind. It felt like graduating from some kind of extended adolescence where I'd let other people make decisions about my own home. Inside, I deleted Sophie from our shared streaming accounts, our shared cloud storage, our joint credit card that she'd never contributed to anyway. Each deletion felt like removing a splinter that had been working its way deeper under my skin for months. I changed passwords, updated emergency contacts, removed her access to everything that mattered. Then I poured myself 3 fingers of the good whiskey I'd been saving for special occasions, sat in my living room that finally felt like mine again, and waited for the phone calls that were sure to come. The first call came at exactly 12:47 a.m., according to my phone's call log, which I checked later like some kind of forensic investigator analyzing the timeline of his own marriage's death. Sophie's name lit up my screen with that photo I'd taken of her laughing at some restaurant last summer, back when I thought her smile was meant for me instead of whatever joke David had probably texted her while I was paying the dinner bill. I let it ring. 5 times, 6 times, until it went to voicemail with that cheerful greeting we'd recorded together. Hey, you've reached Sophie and Adrian. We can't come to the phone right now, but leave a message and we'll get back to you. God, we sounded so fucking happy in that recording. Like 2 people who actually enjoyed each other's company and shared a life that meant something to both of them. The second call came at 1:03 a.m., and I have to admit, there was something deeply satisfying about watching my phone buzz on the coffee table while I sat there sipping whiskey and enjoying the silence of my own home. No background noise of Sophie's constant phone conversations, no sound of her texting someone while pretending to watch whatever movie I'd chosen. No clicking of her expensive heels on the hardwood floors as she paced around talking to people who weren't me about things that apparently mattered more than our marriage. By the third call at 1:15, I was starting to wonder if maybe I should feel some kind of guilt about ignoring her. After all, we'd been married for 3 years, lived together for 4, and there had been good times mixed in with all the bullshit. But then I remembered that text message, "I'll be staying at David's tonight. Don't wait up," and how casually she'd announced her intention to sleep in another man's bed, and any impulse toward guilt evaporated like steam from my coffee cup. The fourth call was at 1:28, and the fifth at 1:41. By this point, I was actually starting to enjoy the show. It was like watching someone realize they'd locked themselves out of their own house. Except Sophie had locked herself out of a life that had been supporting her while she explored other options. The panic in her repeated calls was probably the first real emotion she'd shown about our relationship in months. I'd moved from the living room to the kitchen by the sixth call at 1:56, mainly because I needed to eat something to soak up the whiskey before I did something truly stupid like answer the phone and try to have a rational conversation with a woman who'd just blown up my life via text message. I made myself a sandwich, turkey and Swiss on the good bread that Sophie always complained was too expensive, even though she'd never contributed a dime to our grocery budget. The seventh call came while I was chewing, and I have to say, there's something liberating about eating a sandwich in your own kitchen at 2 in the morning while your cheating wife's phone calls go straight to voicemail. It felt like the first honest meal I'd eaten in months, food that I bought with my own money in a house that I paid for, without having to worry about someone judging my choices or making passive-aggressive comments about my eating habits. By 2:30, the calls had stopped, and I figured Sophie had either given up or found someone else to call for help with her sudden housing crisis. Maybe David was busy explaining to his neighbors why there were 8 boxes of women's clothing outside his apartment door. Maybe Sophie was frantically trying to figure out how to spin this situation into something that didn't make her look like exactly what she was, a cheating wife whose husband had finally grown a backbone. I just started to relax, thinking maybe the drama was over for the night, when my phone erupted again at exactly 3 a.m. This time, Sophie's name was accompanied by that urgent double ring that meant she was calling repeatedly, hanging up, and calling again like some kind of human emergency broadcast system. Against my better judgment, and probably because the whiskey had made me curious about what kind of excuse she'd managed to construct in the past 2 hours, I answered on the fourth ring. "Adrian." Her voice was different than I'd heard it in months, cracked and shaky and completely stripped of that confident, controlled tone she used when she was managing me like one of her supposed work projects. "Adrian, what is this? Why are my things at David's door?" I leaned back in my kitchen chair, suddenly feeling like I had all the time in the world to have this conversation. For once, Sophie was the one who needed something from me, who was waiting for my response, who was off balance and scrambling for explanations. It was a refreshing change from our usual dynamic where I was the one asking questions, and she was the one providing carefully crafted non-answers. "You said you were staying at David's," I replied, keeping my voice as calm and reasonable as if we were discussing weekend plans or what to watch on Netflix. "I helped you move." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped, but then I heard her breathing, that rapid, shallow sound people make when they're trying not to hyperventilate. When she finally spoke, her voice was higher, more desperate. "Adrian, this is crazy. It was work-related, okay? We had this emergency situation with the Henderson account, and David's got all the files at his place, and it just made sense for me to stay over rather than drive home late and then come back early in the morning. It's not what you think." I almost laughed out loud. After 3 years of marriage, Sophie was finally explaining herself to me, and her explanation was exactly the kind of corporate bullshit I'd been swallowing for months. Emergency situations that required overnight stays. Files that couldn't be accessed during normal business hours. Work that was so urgent it required sleepover dates with male colleagues. "Huh," I said, taking another sip of whiskey and enjoying the way the silence made her squirm. "That's interesting. Because in my experience, work emergencies usually involve hotels, not sleepovers at coworkers' apartments. Companies tend to have policies about that kind of thing." "Adrian, you're being ridiculous. You know how demanding my job is. You know how important this account is to my career. I can't believe you're making this into something it's not." And there it was, the classic Sophie move, turned the conversation around so that I was the problem. I was the one being unreasonable. I was the one who didn't understand the demands of her very important career that somehow never generated enough income to contribute to our household expenses. You're right, I said, and I could practically hear her sigh of relief through the phone. Work is very demanding. But here's the thing, Sophie. Work has hotels. Work has conference rooms. Work has office buildings with security guards and proper lighting and expense accounts for emergency accommodations. Work doesn't require you to bring pajamas to David's apartment. The silence was even longer this time, and when she finally spoke, her voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. How did you? I mean, what makes you think? What makes me think you packed an overnight bag to go to a work emergency? I finished for her. Maybe because you've been doing it for months, Sophie. Maybe because every time you have one of these work emergencies, you somehow need clothes and toiletries and all the other things you'd need if you were planning to spend the night somewhere that wasn't home. I could hear her trying to control her breathing, probably running through her mental database of lies and half-truths to find something that would get her out of this conversation with her story intact. But for once, I wasn't going to make it easy for her. For once, she was going to have to face the consequences of her choices without me providing a soft landing. Adrian, please, she said finally, and now she was crying, real tears that I could hear through the phone. This is all a misunderstanding. Can we just talk about this like adults? Can I come home so we can work this out? Home. She wanted to come home to the house she'd never paid for, to sleep in the bed she'd abandoned for another man, to continue the charade that we were married to each other instead of just her being married to my bank account while she lived her real life somewhere else. Here's the thing about coming home, Sophie, I said, standing up and walking to the window that looked out over the street where I'd parked after delivering her belongings. Home is where you choose to be. Tonight, you chose to be at David's. I just helped you make that choice permanent. What does that mean? She asked, and now there was real panic in her voice, the sound of someone who was finally starting to understand that actions have consequences and choices have prices. It means your things are where you are. It means you've got everything you need to start your new life with David. It means you don't need to worry about coming back here because there's nothing here for you anymore. Adrian, please, you can't be serious. Where am I supposed to go? What am I supposed to do? And that's when I delivered the line I'd been rehearsing in my head for the past 3 hours, the words that felt like finally exhaling after holding my breath for months. Well, Sophie, it seems like David's couch is available. Maybe you two can figure it out together. I hung up the phone, turned off the ringer, and headed upstairs to sleep in the middle of my own bed for the first time in years. Chapter 6, Family and Flying Monkeys. I woke up Wednesday morning feeling more rested than I had in months, probably because I'd slept through the night without wondering where my wife was or what time she'd stumble home smelling like someone else's cologne. The bed felt enormous with just me in it, like I'd been sharing a twin mattress for 3 years without realizing it. Sunlight was streaming through the windows in a way that seemed brighter somehow, as if Sophie's presence had been filtering the light along with everything else in my life. That peaceful morning vibe lasted exactly until 7:23 a.m., when my phone started ringing with a number I recognized but hadn't seen in months. Clara, Sophie's mother, calling with what I could only assume would be the opening salvo in the family guilt campaign. Clara had never liked me, which I'd always found ironic since I was the one financially supporting her daughter while Sophie found herself in whatever career du jour she was claiming to pursue. But apparently being a reliable provider wasn't enough to earn points with a woman who thought her precious daughter deserved a man with a trust fund and a summer house in the Hamptons. Adrian. Clara's voice came through the phone like nails on a chalkboard, pitched at that particular frequency that wealthy women use when they're about to lecture someone they consider beneath them. What the hell do you think you're doing to my daughter? I was standing in my kitchen making coffee, actually enjoying the process for the first time in months because I didn't have to worry about Sophie complaining that it was too strong or too weak or somehow not meeting her exacting standards. And Clara's shrill tone made me smile instead of cringe. Good morning, Clara, I said, deliberately cheerful in the way that I knew would piss her off. I'm doing great, thanks for asking. How are you this lovely Wednesday morning? Don't you dare take that tone with me, young man, she snapped, and I could practically picture her standing in her perfectly decorated kitchen, probably wearing one of those expensive robes that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Sophie called me at 6 in the morning, crying her eyes out because you threw her onto the street like some kind of common criminal. The threw her onto the street narrative was classic Sophie, making herself the victim in a situation where she'd been the one making choices. I'd been married to her long enough to recognize the spin. Somehow, my wife sleeping at another man's house became me being cruel and unreasonable. Somehow, her abandoning our marriage became me abandoning her. Well, Clara, that's interesting, I said, taking a sip of my perfectly brewed coffee and settling into a kitchen chair that didn't wobble because I'd finally fixed it last weekend without Sophie complaining about the noise. Because from where I'm sitting, Sophie chose to stay at David's place. I just helped her with the logistics. You know damn well what you did, Clara shot back, her voice rising to that pitch that probably made dogs in the neighborhood start howling. You can't just throw a person's belongings out on the street and change the locks like some kind of landlord evicting a tenant. That was the thing about Sophie's family. They had this amazing ability to rewrite history in real time, turning Sophie's choices into things that happened to her rather than decisions she'd made. It was like watching magicians work, except instead of pulling rabbits out of hats, they pulled victimhood out of adultery. Actually, Clara, I said, enjoying the way my calm tone seemed to make her even more agitated. See, Sophie doesn't live here anymore. She made that pretty clear when she decided to spend her nights at David's place. I'm just respecting her decision to relocate. She's your wife. Clara practically screamed, and I had to hold the phone away from my ear to protect my hearing. You took vows. You made promises. You can't just throw away a marriage because of some silly misunderstanding. Silly misunderstanding. That's what Sophie's mother called her daughter's affair. A silly misunderstanding. Like Sophie had accidentally ended up in another man's bed the way you might accidentally take the wrong exit on the highway. You're absolutely right about the vows, I agreed, which seemed to catch Clara off guard because she went quiet for a moment. I promised to love, honor, and cherish Sophie. I kept those promises right up until she decided they didn't apply to her. Funny how that works. Sophie is going through a difficult time in her career, Clara said, switching tactics the way Sophie always did when one approach wasn't working. She's under enormous pressure, and sometimes people make mistakes when they're stressed. That doesn't mean you abandon them. Career pressure. That was rich, considering Sophie's career seemed to consist mainly of networking events that never resulted in any actual business and client meetings that happened exclusively at David's apartment. But Clara had always been willing to make excuses for her daughter's behavior, treating Sophie like she was still a teenager who couldn't be held responsible for her own choices. Here's the thing about mistakes, Clara, I said, standing up to refill my coffee cup because this conversation was going to require caffeine. Mistakes are things like forgetting to pick up milk or missing an anniversary dinner. Sleeping with your coworker for months while your husband pays all your bills? That's not a mistake. That's a choice. The silence on the other end told me that Clara was probably scrambling for her next argument, rifling through her mental playbook of guilt trips and emotional manipulation techniques. Sophie had learned from a master, and watching the family dynamics play out was like getting a behind-the-scenes look at how my wife had developed her talent for making other people responsible for her bad decisions. You're going to regret this, Clara finally said, her voice dropping to that ominous tone that mothers use when they're trying to sound prophetic instead of just vindictive. Sophie is a wonderful woman, and you're going to realize what you've lost when it's too late to get her back. You know what, Clara? You might be right, I said, and again the agreement seemed to throw her off balance. I might regret losing a woman who never contributed financially to our household, who spent her evenings with other men while I cooked dinner alone, and who announced her intention to sleep at her lover's house via text message. That sounds like a real loss. How dare you? Clara started, but I was done being lectured by a woman who'd raised a daughter to think that marriage was a financial arrangement where only one person had to honor their commitments. Actually, Clara, I dare pretty easily, I interrupted, feeling something like relief wash over me as I finally stopped being polite to people who'd never shown me the same courtesy. I dare to expect my wife to come home at night. I dare to think that marriage means being honest with each other. I dare to believe that if someone wants to live with another man, they should probably divorce their husband first. The sputtering sounds coming through the phone told me that Clara had finally run out of prepared arguments and was operating on pure outrage. It was probably the first time in years that someone had talked back to her instead of just accepting her version of reality, where Sophie was always the victim and everyone else was always the problem. "You'll be hearing from our lawyer," Clara finally managed, playing her last card with all the conviction of someone who'd never actually hired a lawyer but thought the threat might work anyway. "Looking forward to it," I replied cheerfully. "Make sure you tell him that Sophie had no lease, paid no rent, and contributed nothing to the mortgage or utilities. I'm sure he'll find that very interesting from a legal standpoint." The line went dead, and I realized Clara had hung up on me, probably because she'd finally understood that her daughter's situation wasn't quite as legally solid as she'd hoped. Turns out, being married doesn't automatically give you ownership rights to property you never paid for, especially when you've been using that property as a home base while conducting an affair. My phone immediately started buzzing with a text from a number I didn't recognize, and when I opened it, I found a message from someone named Mason. "Dude, why the fuck did you dump your wife's shit at my apartment? David's freaking out and Sophie's crying in our living room, and I just want to watch Netflix without all this drama." So Mason was David's roommate, and apparently David hadn't bothered to explain to his living situation that he'd been collecting married women along with their belongings. I typed back quickly. "Check Sophie's text messages from last night. She told me she was staying at David's. I was just being helpful." The response came back almost immediately. "Holy shit." Then, a few seconds later, "This is so fucked up." I couldn't argue with that assessment. By Thursday morning, Sophie had apparently decided that emotional manipulation wasn't working fast enough, so she'd moved on to the nuclear option, financial warfare. I discovered this delightful development when my phone started buzzing with fraud alerts at 9:17 a.m., while I was sitting in my office trying to focus on blueprints for a client who actually paid their bills on time. The first alert was from my credit card company, one of those automated messages that always sound like they're delivered by robots who've been trained to express concern without actually giving a shit. "We've detected unusual activity on your account. A charge of $847 at Nordstrom has been declined due to insufficient available credit. If this was not you, please call immediately." $847 at Nordstrom. That was Sophie's panic shopping amount, the exact dollar figure she always seemed to hit when she was stressed and decided that retail therapy was the solution to her problems. Except this time, she was trying to charge her emotional breakdown to my credit card while simultaneously fucking another man in his apartment. The audacity was almost impressive. I called the credit card company immediately, partly because I'm responsible about these things and partly because I was curious to see exactly how far Sophie planned to push this particular boundary. The customer service representative was a guy named Kevin who sounded like he'd been dealing with domestic financial drama since before the internet was invented. "Mr. Holt, we show several attempts to use your card starting around 8 this morning," Kevin said, his voice carrying that practiced neutrality of someone who'd heard every possible variation of marital financial warfare. "The first was at a coffee shop for $12, which went through. Then we had the Nordstrom charge I mentioned, followed by attempts at Target, a gas station, and something called Bella Vista Salon and Spa." Bella Vista Salon and Spa. Sophie was trying to charge a spa day to my credit card while homeless by her own choice, living on David's couch because she'd blown up her marriage for a guy who apparently hadn't thought through the logistics of suddenly acquiring a full-time mistress with expensive tastes and no income. "Kevin," I said, leaning back in my desk chair and trying not to laugh at the absurdity of the situation, "I need to report unauthorized use of my card. The person making these charges is my estranged wife, and she no longer has permission to use this account." "I understand, sir. We'll need to cancel this card immediately and issue you a new one. Can you confirm that you're in possession of the physical card?" I checked my wallet, where my credit card was sitting exactly where it should be. "Yes, I have the card." She must be using the number from memory. "That's not uncommon in these situations," Kevin said with the weary tone of someone who'd seen this movie too many times. "We'll flag the account for fraud monitoring and send you a new card with a different number. Is there anything else we should know about potential unauthorized usage?" "Actually, yes," I said, pulling up my online banking on my computer because I had a feeling this was just the beginning. "Can you check if there have been any credit applications submitted using my information recently?" The pause on Kevin's end told me everything I needed to know before he even spoke. "Mr. Holt, I'm showing a credit application submitted yesterday evening for a card with a $15,000 limit. The application was approved, and the card was expedited for delivery to an address that doesn't match our records for your account. $15,000. Sophie had tried to open a credit card in my name with a limit that would cover several months of her expensive lifestyle, probably figuring she could run up the charges and disappear before I noticed. The address she'd used was almost certainly David's apartment, because apparently my wife thought identity theft was a reasonable next step in her journey of self-discovery. Kevin, I did not apply for that card, I said, my voice staying calm even though I was starting to feel that familiar burn of anger in my chest. I need to report this as identity theft and fraud. Absolutely, sir. I'm transferring you to our fraud department, and they'll walk you through the process of filing a police report. This is a serious crime, and we take it very seriously. While I waited on hold for the fraud department, I opened my laptop and started checking all my other accounts. Sure enough, Sophie had been busy. There were login attempts on my bank account from an IP address that wasn't mine, probably David's home computer. She tried to access my investment account, my PayPal, even my fucking Amazon account, presumably to order herself a new life using my money. The fraud department representative was a woman named Detective Harris. Apparently, the credit card company had actual detectives on staff for situations like this, which said something depressing about how common spousal financial crime had become in America. Mr. Holt, based on what I'm seeing here, your wife has committed multiple felonies, Detective Harris said without any of the customer service politeness I'd gotten from Kevin. Identity theft, credit fraud, attempted wire fraud. We're talking about serious jail time if she's convicted. What are my options? I asked, because while part of me wanted to see Sophie face consequences for her actions, another part of me just wanted this nightmare to end so I could move on with my life. You can file a police report and press charges, which I strongly recommend. Or you can try to handle this privately, but that leaves you vulnerable to future fraud attempts. In my experience, people who steal from their spouses don't usually stop at the first attempt. That crystallized something for me. Sophie wasn't just cheating on me. She was stealing from me. She wasn't just ending our marriage. She was trying to rob me on her way out the door. Every boundary I'd ever trusted her to respect, she was systematically destroying in her quest to avoid the consequences of her own choices. I want to press charges, I said, the words coming out easier than I'd expected. All of them. Everything you mentioned. Good choice, Mr. Holt. I'll send you the paperwork, and we'll coordinate with your local police department. You'll need to file a report with them as well, but we'll provide all the documentation they need. I hung up feeling something I hadn't experienced in months, genuine relief. For the first time since this whole mess started, Sophie was going to face real consequences for her actions. Not the gentle social consequences of people knowing she was a cheater, but actual legal consequences that couldn't be spun or explained away or blamed on someone else. My phone rang almost immediately, and Sophie's name appeared on the screen with that photo of her laughing at some restaurant. Except now she looked like a stranger to me, someone I'd never really known at all. You bastard, she said the moment I answered, her voice shaking with rage instead of the tears I'd heard the night before. You reported my cards as stolen? Are you fucking kidding me right now? I reported fraudulent use of my credit accounts. I corrected, enjoying the precision of the language in a way that probably made me petty, but definitely made me feel better. Since you're no longer authorized to use those accounts, any charges you make constitute fraud. I'm your wife, she screamed, and I had to hold the phone away from my ear again. We're married. I have a right to access our accounts. Actually, Sophie, you don't, I said, opening my laptop to double-check the legal information I'd researched the night before while she was having her meltdown at David's place. Marriage doesn't give you automatic access to accounts you're not named on, and it definitely doesn't give you the right to open new credit accounts in my name. The silence on the other end told me that Sophie was probably realizing for the first time that her legal position wasn't as strong as she'd assumed. Turns out, being married doesn't actually entitle you to steal from your spouse, even if you're really sad about the consequences of your own choices. Adrian, this is insane, she said, her voice dropping to that manipulative tone she used when she was trying to make me feel guilty for her problems. I just needed some cash to get back on my feet. You know I don't have access to money right now. Right, because you've been spending your time fucking David instead of working, I replied, and the bluntness of my language seemed to shock her into silence. That was your choice, Sophie. The consequences are also your choice to deal with. You can't do this to me, she said, and now she was crying again. Those calculated tears she'd always used to end arguments before I could make my point. You'll ruin my life. You'll ruin my career. David and I both got reported to HR because of you, and now this? You're destroying everything. The HR thing was news to me, but it made sense. Most companies have policies about employees sleeping with each other, especially when it involves married people and creates workplace drama. Apparently, someone at Sophie's office had noticed that she was spending an unusual amount of time with David and decided to report it to the appropriate authorities. Here's the thing about ruining your life, Sophie, I said, standing up and walking to my office window that looked out over the city where I'd built a career and a reputation and a life that had nothing to do with her drama. I'm not ruining anything. You made choices. You chose to cheat. You chose to lie. You chose to steal. I'm just choosing not to enable those choices anymore. This isn't over, she said, her voice turning hard and threatening in a way I'd never heard before. My mother's calling her lawyer. You can't just throw me out and steal my life and expect me to disappear quietly. Actually, I can, I said, feeling something like peace settle over me as I realized how much simpler my life was going to be without Sophie's constant drama and manipulation. And I am. Your life isn't here anymore, Sophie. It's wherever you choose to build it next. Just make sure you do it with your own money. I hung up on her for the second time in 2 days, and it felt even better than the first time. My phone immediately buzzed with another call, this time from Clara again, but I sent it straight to voicemail. Whatever guilt trip or legal threat she wanted to deliver could wait. I had work to do, and for the first time in months, I could actually focus on it without wondering what crisis or lie or financial emergency Sophie would present me with when I got home. The rest of the day passed quietly, productively, like days used to pass before my life became a constant negotiation with someone who saw our marriage as a business arrangement where I provided all the capital and she provided nothing but problems. Around 6 o'clock, Detective Harris called me back with an update that made my entire week. Mr. Holt, we've been in touch with the local police, and they're ready to move forward with the charges. Your wife's been arrested. Chapter 8, the U-Haul invasion. Sophie's arrest lasted exactly 18 hours, which I know because I may have checked the county jail website more than once to see when she'd been released. Not because I was worried about her. Fuck that. But because I wanted to know when the next wave of crazy would hit my doorstep. Experience had taught me that Sophie's periods of quiet usually preceded dramatic escalations, like the calm before hurricanes that leave trailer parks looking like war zones. I didn't have to wait long. Saturday morning at 9:47 a.m., I was sitting in my kitchen drinking coffee and reading the news on my tablet like a civilized human being when the sound of grinding gears and aggressive diesel engine noise announced that my peaceful weekend was about to go straight to hell. Through my front window, I watched a bright orange U-Haul truck lumber down my street like some kind of moving apocalypse, driven by someone who clearly had no fucking clue how to operate a vehicle that size. The truck lurched to a stop directly in front of my townhouse, taking up enough space for 3 normal cars and blocking my neighbor's driveway in the process. The engine shut off with a wheeze that suggested this particular U-Haul had seen better decades, and then the doors opened to disgorge what looked like Sophie's personal army of flying monkeys. Sophie herself jumped out of the passenger side, wearing dark sunglasses that couldn't quite hide the fact that she looked like she'd been crying for the better part of 2 days. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she was wearing jeans and a t-shirt instead of her usual carefully curated outfit, which told me that her stint in county lockup had probably not included access to her usual beauty routine. But Sophie wasn't the main attraction in this particular shit show. That honor belonged to her backup dancers, Trevor and Luke, her cousins from the Jersey side of the family, 2 guys who looked like they'd stepped out of a casting call for generic muscle in low-budget action movie. Trevor was about 6'2" with arms like tree trunks and the kind of perpetual scowl that suggested he'd never met a problem he couldn't solve with his fists. Luke was shorter but wider, built like a refrigerator with legs, and sporting the kind of buzz cut that screamed either military washout or wannabe tough guy. They climbed out of the U-Haul like they were preparing to storm a beach, all swagger and aggressive body language designed to intimidate whoever they were about to encounter. Trevor was carrying a crowbar, which seemed like overkill for what I assumed was supposed to be a conversation about Sophie's belongings. Luke had what looked like a small sledgehammer, because apparently they'd decided that property damage was going to be part of their negotiation strategy. I watched this amateur production unfold through my front window, sipping my coffee and feeling something like amusement mixed with anticipation. Sophie had clearly decided that bringing muscle to intimidate me was her best remaining option, which showed exactly how little she understood about the situation she'd created for herself. They approached my front door like they were conducting a military operation, Sophie hanging back, while Trevor and Luke took point positions on either side of my entrance. Trevor tried the door handle first, apparently surprised to discover that it was locked, which suggested that Sophie hadn't explained the whole changed the locks situation to her hired goons. When the handle didn't turn, Trevor looked back at Sophie with the kind of confusion that indicated thinking wasn't his strongest skill. Sophie gestured impatiently toward the door, probably telling him to break it down, because subtlety had never been her forte and desperation wasn't improving her strategic planning. That's when Trevor raised the crowbar and wedged it between my door and the frame, preparing to pry his way into my house like some kind of discount home invader. Luke positioned himself with the sledgehammer, apparently ready to provide backup percussion if the crowbar approach didn't work. I finished my coffee, set the mug in the sink, and walked to my front door with the calm deliberation of someone who was about to enjoy watching other people make terrible decisions. Through the peephole, I could see Trevor working the crowbar while Sophie stood behind him, gesturing and clearly giving instructions about how to break into the house she'd never actually contributed to purchasing. Instead of opening the door, I pulled out my phone and called my brother Daniel, who lived about 10 minutes away and had been waiting for exactly this kind of call ever since I'd told him about Sophie's midnight relocation to David's apartment. "Danny," I said when he answered, "you know that backup you offered if Sophie tried anything stupid?" "She's trying something stupid?" Daniel asked, and I could hear the grin in his voice. My brother was ex-military, the kind of guy who stayed in shape because he actually enjoyed physical confrontation, and he'd never liked Sophie even during the periods when I thought our marriage was working. "She's at my front door with two guys who look like they bench press small cars for fun, and they're trying to break down my door with a crowbar." "No shit," Daniel laughed, and I heard the sound of keys jingling in the background. "I'll be there in 5 minutes. Try not to let them actually break anything before I arrive." "No promises," I said, watching Trevor make progress with the crowbar, while Sophie bounced on her toes like she was directing a heist instead of committing breaking and entering in broad daylight. Next, I called my friend Nora, who lived 3 blocks away and had been documenting Sophie's increasingly erratic behavior on social media with the dedication of an investigative journalist. Nora was a lawyer who specialized in family law, which meant she understood exactly how valuable video evidence could be in situations like this. "Adrian, what's happening?" Nora answered on the first ring, probably because I never called her on Saturday mornings unless something dramatic was occurring. "Sophie's trying to break into my house with a crowbar and 2 guys who look like they escaped from a prison weight room," I said, still watching the show through my peephole. "Any chance you could come over and document this for posterity?" "Are you fucking kidding me?" Nora practically shouted, and I heard the sound of her grabbing keys and probably the professional camera equipment she kept for exactly these kinds of situations. "I'll be there in 2 minutes. Don't engage with them until I'm recording." "Wouldn't dream of it," I said, though I was definitely planning to engage with them exactly when it would be most useful for my legal position. My third call was to Detective Harris, the fraud investigator who'd handled Sophie's arrest, because I figured someone in law enforcement should probably know that my recently arrested wife was now attempting to commit additional crimes in broad daylight. "Detective Harris," she answered with the professional tone of someone who was probably dealing with multiple cases of domestic financial drama. "Detective, this is Adrian Holt. We spoke about my wife's identity theft case yesterday. I wanted to let you know that she's currently at my house with 2 men who are trying to break down my front door with a crowbar." "Are you serious?" Harris asked, and I could hear her suddenly paying much closer attention. "She's violating the terms of her release by attempting to break into your property. Are you in immediate danger?" "Not really," I said, watching Trevor finally get enough leverage to start splintering the wood around my door frame. "I've got backup coming, and they don't know I'm aware of what they're doing." But I thought you should know that she's escalating. I'm sending a patrol car, Harris said immediately. Don't confront them directly. Let us handle this. Copy that, I said, though I was definitely planning to confront them at exactly the right moment for maximum dramatic effect. Daniel arrived first, parking his truck across the street and walking toward my house with the kind of casual confidence that comes from knowing you can handle whatever situation you're about to encounter. Daniel was built like a brick shithouse, 6'4", 240 pounds of muscle earned through actual military service rather than gym posturing. And he moved with the easy grace of someone who'd been in real fights rather than the aggressive swagger of people who just look tough. Nora showed up 30 seconds later, carrying her camera and practically vibrating with excitement at the prospect of documenting Sophie's latest meltdown. She positioned herself across the street next to Daniel, far enough away to be safe, but close enough to capture everything in high definition. That's when I decided it was time to make my entrance. I opened my front door just as Trevor was putting his full weight behind the crowbar, which meant he stumbled forward when the door suddenly swung open instead of providing resistance. Luke jumped back like he'd been electrocuted, apparently not expecting the door to open from the inside. "Morning, folks," I said cheerfully, like I was greeting neighbors who'd stopped by to borrow a cup of sugar instead of criminals trying to break into my house. "Can I help you with something?" Sophie stepped forward, trying to regain control of a situation that had already spiraled way beyond her ability to manage. She pulled off her sunglasses, revealing eyes that were red-rimmed and puffy from crying, and attempted to summon the commanding presence she'd always used to manipulate me into giving her what she wanted. "Adrian, we need to talk," she said, her voice shaking with a combination of anger and desperation. "You can't just lock me out of my own home and steal my life. I have rights." "Your own home," I repeated, genuinely curious about the legal theory she was operating under. "That's interesting. Do you have a lease? A mortgage? Any documentation showing ownership or legal residence?" Trevor shifted the crowbar in his hands, apparently unsure whether he was supposed to continue with the breaking and entering or switch to intimidation mode. Luke looked even more confused, probably wondering why his cousin had brought him to commit crimes that were being recorded by someone with professional camera equipment. "I lived here for 3 years, Sophie said, her voice rising to that pitch that indicated she was about to lose what remained of her composure. "I'm your wife. I have every right to be in this house." "Actually," said a voice from behind Sophie's little crime family, "she doesn't." We all turned to see Daniel walking up my front walkway, moving with that deliberate calm that people develop when they're comfortable with violence and don't feel the need to prove anything to anyone. Behind him, Nora was filming everything with the focused attention of someone who understood exactly how valuable this footage was going to be. Trevor and Luke immediately shifted into defensive postures, recognizing Daniel as a legitimate threat in a way they probably hadn't expected to encounter. The crowbar and sledgehammer suddenly seemed less like intimidating props and more like evidence of crimes they were actively committing. "And you are?" Trevor asked, trying to inject some authority into his voice despite the fact that he was clearly outclassed. "I'm Adrian's brother," Daniel replied casually, stopping about 6 feet away from the group and crossing his arms in a way that made his considerable musculature impossible to ignore. "And I'm wondering why you're trying to break into his house." That's when we heard the sirens. Officer Harris pulled up in an unmarked police car just as a patrol unit rounded the corner with lights flashing. And suddenly Sophie's plan to intimidate me into submission looked a lot more like what it actually was. A coordinated attempt to commit multiple felonies in broad daylight while being recorded by a lawyer. Trevor dropped the crowbar like it was on fire. Luke set down the sledgehammer and stepped away from it like he'd never seen it before. Sophie looked around wildly, probably trying to figure out how her brilliant plan had gone so wrong so quickly. Harris stepped out of her car with the confidence of someone who'd arrested Sophie once already and was apparently going to get the chance to do it again. The patrol officers flanked her, hands resting casually on their service weapons in that universal police gesture that suggests cooperation would be appreciated but isn't strictly required. "Ms. Holt," Harris said, walking directly to Sophie while the patrol officers kept an eye on Trevor and Luke. "We need to talk." The days after Sophie's second arrest were eerily calm, like the silence that follows a tornado after it's finished rearranging your entire neighborhood. I kept expecting another crisis, another dramatic phone call, Another U-Haul full of family members showing up to intimidate me into taking back a woman who'd made it crystal clear that she preferred sleeping in other men's beds to being married to me. But nothing came. Just blessed, beautiful silence. I rediscovered what my house sounded like without constant drama echoing through every room. Coffee brewing in the morning without someone complaining that it was too strong. Music playing at whatever volume I wanted without negotiations about my inconsiderate taste in everything from volume levels to song choices. The dishwasher running without someone bitching about the way I loaded it. As if there was some fucking PhD required to arrange plates and cups in a machine designed by engineers specifically for that purpose. For the first time in years, I could eat dinner without checking my phone every 5 minutes to see if Sophie was going to grace me with her presence or if I'd be dining alone again while she networked with David and whoever else was more important than the guy paying all her bills. I made myself a steak on Wednesday night. A good one. The kind Sophie always said was too expensive despite never contributing to the grocery budget, and ate it while watching a documentary about architecture that she would have vetoed in favor of some reality TV bullshit about rich housewives destroying each other's lives. The silence felt like freedom instead of loneliness, which probably said everything anyone needed to know about the state my marriage had been in before Sophie decided to make her affair official by moving in with her boyfriend. Clara kept calling, but I learned the valuable lesson that just because someone dials your number doesn't mean you're obligated to answer. Her voicemail swung between begging and threatening like a pendulum powered by pure maternal delusion. One message would be her crying about how I was destroying her baby's life, and the next would be her promising that their lawyer was going to take me for everything I was worth, apparently forgetting that everything I was worth had been earned while Sophie contributed nothing but drama and credit card debt. I saved all the voicemails, not because I enjoyed listening to Clara's emotional breakdown, but because Nora had explained that documentation was key in situations like this. Crazy people tell you exactly who they are if you let them talk long enough, she'd said while helping me organize all the evidence of Sophie's increasingly unhinged behavior. The trick is recording it when they do. The best part about Clara's threats was how empty they turned out to be. Apparently, finding a lawyer willing to argue that Sophie had ownership rights to property she'd never paid for while she was actively being prosecuted for identity theft and attempted breaking and entering was harder than Clara had expected. Turns out, most attorneys prefer clients whose legal position isn't completely fucking hopeless. My work life improved dramatically without the constant interruption of Sophie's manufactured crises. Projects that had been dragging for weeks suddenly moved forward at normal speeds because I wasn't constantly distracted by phone calls about her latest drama or financial emergency. My clients started commenting on how much more focused I seemed, how much more creative my designs had become, like I'd been working with one hand tied behind my back and had finally cut myself loose. The townhouse felt bigger somehow, like Sophie's presence had been compressing the space and I was finally able to expand into my own home. I rearranged furniture that had been positioned to accommodate her preferences, bought groceries that I actually wanted to eat instead of whatever was on sale, because we need to watch our spending. Translation. I needed to watch my spending while she spent freely on things I never saw. I started sleeping in the middle of the bed again, spreading out like a normal human being instead of clinging to one edge, while Sophie sprawled across 3/4 of the mattress like she was trying to claim territory in her sleep. The bedroom felt cleaner without her clutter everywhere, brighter without the heavy curtains she'd insisted on because she was sensitive to morning light, but somehow never had trouble waking up early enough to get to David's place for their breakfast meetings. Even my neighbors seemed more relaxed. Mrs. Patterson from next door stopped by with cookies and mentioned how much quieter things had been lately, how nice it was not to hear shouting and door slamming at all hours. I hadn't realized how much of Sophie's drama had been bleeding into other people's lives, making everyone around us walk on eggshells because they never knew when the next explosion was coming. The freedom was intoxicating in a way I hadn't expected. For 3 years, I'd structured my life around someone else's moods, preferences, and manufactured emergencies. I'd made myself smaller to accommodate someone who was using that space to plan her exit strategy. Now, suddenly, I could make decisions based on what I wanted instead of what would avoid triggering Sophie's next meltdown. I bought a new coffee maker, one of those expensive ones Sophie had always said was wasteful, but that made coffee good enough to justify the investment. I painted the living room a color I actually liked instead of the neutral beige Sophie had chosen because it was safe and wouldn't offend anyone, as if our home was supposed to be a hotel lobby instead of a place where people actually lived. For the first time in years, my house felt like mine again, clean, quiet, and honest in a way it hadn't been since Sophie had started her double life with David while I paid for the privilege of being lied to in my own home. 3 weeks later, I was walking past my own front door, the one that now had fresh paint covering the damage from Trevor's crowbar adventure, when I caught myself automatically checking for moving trucks or angry family members lurking in the bushes. Old habits die hard, I guess, especially when those habits involve scanning for incoming drama from people who think marriage licenses double as theft permits. But the street was quiet, just normal Saturday morning suburban calm, with kids riding bikes and neighbors walking dogs and nobody trying to break into my house or steal my identity or convince me that supporting a cheating spouse was somehow my moral obligation. That's when my father's words echoed in my head again, clearer than they'd been since the night I'd packed Sophie's belongings into those 8 boxes. When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. Sophie had been showing me who she was for months, maybe years. The secret of phone calls, the mysterious networking events that never resulted in actual business, the financial arrangement where I funded her life while she lived it with other people. The problem wasn't that she'd hidden her true nature. The problem was that I'd been so invested in the fantasy of our marriage that I'd ignored every piece of evidence that contradicted the story I wanted to believe. I'd spent 3 years making excuses for someone who'd never asked me to make them, covering expenses for someone who'd never thanked me for covering them, and waiting at home for someone who'd been planning their exit strategy since before I even knew there was an exit to plan. But here's the thing about rock bottom. It gives you a solid foundation to build on. Standing there on my own front walk step, looking at the door I'd had to repair because my wife thought breaking and entering was a reasonable response to facing consequences for her own choices, I realized I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Genuine optimism about my future. Not optimism based on someone else changing their behavior or finally appreciating what they had or suddenly developing the moral compass they'd apparently been born without. Just simple, honest optimism about what I could build with my own life, my own money, and my own decisions. My house was mine again. Every mortgage payment, every utility bill, every grocery receipt paid for by someone who actually lived there and gave a damn about maintaining it. My bank account was mine again, protected by passwords that only I knew and used for purchases that only I made. My time was mine again, spent on projects I cared about, and people who actually wanted to spend time with me rather than whatever I could provide for them. The freedom was addictive in the best possible way. Sophie's last contact had been a text message sent through her lawyer, some formal legal bullshit about equitable distribution of marital assets, that basically translated to, "Please give me money even though I contributed nothing and stole from you." My response, also sent through Nora, had been a detailed accounting of every expense I'd covered during our marriage, along with documentation of Sophie's financial contributions, which averaged out to about $37 per month if you counted the occasional coffee she'd bought while we were out together. Turns out, equitable distribution doesn't mean much when one party did all the distributing and the other party did all the taking. Her final words to me, shouted as Harris led her away in handcuffs for the second time, had been, "You'll regret losing me, Adrian. You'll never find anyone better." But standing there in front of my own house, breathing air that didn't smell like lies and manipulation and manufactured crisis, I realized Sophie had been wrong about that, too. I wouldn't regret losing her. I'd only regret how long it had taken me to let her go. And with that realization, I walked through my own front door, closed it behind me, and got on with the business of building a life worth living, alone, honest, and finally, completely free.